Hi, I'm Brian Russell, and I want to move to the next stage in Israel's story. We've talked previously about God's creation of a very good world that reached its climax in Sabbath, in which God created men and women to be his hands, feet, mouthpieces in the world. Then we talked about how creation became undone, or at least God's original creation and creational intentions were undone through the entrance of human sin and men and women's continuing ongoing capacity to move outside of the limits that God had created for our own good, to go our own way. And all that brought into creation is lostness and brokenness, both people and creation as a whole. And I've tried to summarize that with this chart that we're continuing to build. Again, it starts with creation, and we should put a very good creation that reaches its climax, the creational climax with the creation of men and women, but then with the institution of Sabbath. Then in Genesis 3 to 11, we had all of these stories that then tell us about how that very good creation became the world that we find ourselves in today. And so we talked about Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's flood, and Babel, and then interspersed in there were genealogies that played key roles to essentially show how humanity continued to multiply and be fruitful, with the problem being, though, that though humanity is being fruitful, that humanity remains lost. And so though the potential's there to be God's missional people that he created humanity to be, the problem now at the end of Genesis 3 to 11 is that humanity still has its original role as stewards of creation, though it's not filling that out. And also, humanity itself now needs to be saved and experience God's grace and salvation. So how is God going to respond to that? Again, there's no more floods. God isn't going to redo everything. As we saw, though, that issue was settled in Genesis 3 to 11, and we have that Noahic covenant that promises that God will never again have a do-over with creation. And instead, what God does at a pivotal moment, and this is where we have a key shift in Scripture, at Genesis chapter 12, God is going to call one for the sake of the many. And another feature that we saw in Genesis 1 to 11 was that these stories were universal. There is no Israel per se, but instead, the scriptures open up with a view of how ultimately Israel is going to fit into its entire world. So these are global stories. These are universal stories that are about all people everywhere in the scriptures, in the world. But at Genesis 12, a key point changes. We move from the universal to the particular. And this particular is going to continue on, and I'm drawing this sloping upwards until we get to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's at that point, post-resurrection, that the biblical story will then again open up and become universal, in the sense that in the New Testament, post-resurrection, Jesus is going to send his people with the gospel to ultimately fulfill what God is going to call Abram and then ultimately Abraham to embody. That's going to be a mission to all the nations. And again, that's in anticipation of the final episode of the biblical story of new creation. So the story is going to move from creation to new creation. We find ourselves with the third part, Israel, a new hope. And we're going to talk about Israel's ancestors before we begin moving into the rest of the Old Testament. But notice again, we'll misread the Old Testament if we miss this move from universal to particular. I want you to hear God's calling of Abram. This is an important, a critical passage in the Old Testament. It's Genesis chapter 12. Abram's story actually begins at the end of chapter 11, so you can take a look at the last paragraph or so in chapter 11, where we have a genealogy and we have a report that Abram's father, Terah, had begun to move his family from the old world, from Mesopotamia towards Canaan, but they'd stopped at Haran. Now, God picks Abram and calls Abram to go all the way to Canaan to become a new community. And so notice this text. Let's hear the first three verses, then we'll read a little bit more. so that when we see that the gospel advances, it's not by human power or using the typical human channels of success, but it's by the power of God. And so let's get back to that call. Abram is called, and God promises to bless him so that he can be a blessing. And notice how that even manifests itself in a bigger way. Look at verse 12:3, especially the second half of that. It says, all peoples on earth will be blessed. Genesis 12:3b is one of the key texts that help us to understand the Bible missionally. All families on earth is what? It's the families that we saw in Genesis 1-11. God is going to use Abram and his descendants as the means of blessing all peoples on earth. This isn't just going to be a isolated theme. We're going to see verses like that reverberate. In fact, part of the calling of God's people is that these promises are going to be repeated to Abraham over and over again. So, for example, Abram's going to receive a similar promise to this also in Genesis chapter 18, verse 18, chapter 22, verses 17 to 18. These promises are going to get handed on to Isaac in chapters 26, 3 and 4, and then to Jacob in 28, 13 to 14. We're also going to see this kind of promise of this idea of blessing the nations is going to show up in the Sinai covenant as well. And so Israel, again, we draw it this way. It goes from the universal to the particular, but Israel exists as a particular because God is going to use this one family and ultimately this nation as the means of blessing all people. So this is the setup for the rest of the Old Testament, the calling of Israel's ancestors. And one of the things that we also have to understand is that the Old Testament looks back on these persons as the first persons to respond to God. And so if we go on, I want to look at a couple more verses of chapter 12. Look at verse 4. And this is a significant verse. The first 3 verses are God's big promises. Don't miss the significance of verse 4. So Abraham went. That's faithfulness in practice. One of the key pieces of what it means to live as God's missional people is faithfulness. And in essence, we don't know if God had called other people before Abraham, but the one thing that we do know is that Abraham received God's promises and did what? He acted on them. And so when God calls, God makes unconditional promises that still requires some response. And Abram's initial response is faithfulness. Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions that they had accumulated in the people that they had acquired in Haran. They set out as far as the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. Notice that in these promises, again, Abram's called to be a blessing to the nations. That's a key part of what it means to be God's missional people. It's going to be a blessing to the nations, but also notice that specifically to Israel's ancestors, God also promises land. That's going to be a key theme. It's going to be the land of Canaan. This is going to be the toehold on the planet from which God is going to build his kingdom, and it's going to slowly manifest to all the nations in anticipation of new creation. He also promises Abram offspring. He's going to have descendants. This is significant because why? Abram and Sarah are already old and they don't have any children. So God is going to do for them what they obviously couldn't do for themselves, and are either going to have the blessing of descendants. And so these are going to be the promises that are going to be passed on to Isaac and then to Jacob and then throughout Israel's generation. So Israel is called blessed to be a blessing. This is God's missional community that exists to reflect God's character to, for, and in the world for the sake of the nations, to bring them good news. And so again, Abram moves from the old world to this new world. He acts with faithfulness. God gives promises. So a big piece of this initial section, especially Genesis 12 to 50, is going to be on God's faithfulness to God's promises. I'll write that really big. God's promises. This is the way that the story unfolds, because we've already seen in Genesis 3 to 11, if left to their own, human beings don't live up to their end. So in Genesis 12 to 50, God advances his mission through promise and his faithfulness to that. Again, all it takes is Abram to say, okay, I'll go. But essentially, God is the driver of the story. And we'll stop here and we'll pick this up in part 2. And I will see you then. Again, I'm Brian Russell, and thanks for listening. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Again, we can't overemphasize these first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 12 enough, because they give us a picture of what God's answer to the problem of a very good creation that fell. And that answer is, again, isn't another flood. This answer is a new community, a new hope, a new humanity. God calls Abram and his family. And again, this sounds like it's just one solitary call, but remember, Abram's married. He has a wife named Sarah. He has a large constituency that goes with him. As we see, if you read through Genesis 12 to 50, you see that Abram's got several hundred people with him. So this isn't just one lone guy working alone, pulling himself up by his bootstraps. This is a whole community. But what God does in these verses is God makes promises. These are really unconditional promises to Abram, offers him these things, and he calls Abram to leave the old. Just as Jesus didn't start his ministry at the center in Jerusalem, but instead was up in Galilee when he began his ministry, so also Abram, who was from Ur ultimately, from Mesopotamia, from a traditional center of power, God doesn't begin the mission there. God calls Abram to go to a new place, kind of a backwoods area. Canaan was between Mesopotamia on one side and Egypt on the other. There were people living there, and there were actually some significant cities, but for the most part, the land of Canaan was more empty. It was a borderland area, if you want to call that. You went through there to get to Mesopotamia or Egypt, or even up to where the Hittites are going to be. And so this is significant. God creates his mission by calling a new people out of the old world to create a new place, a toehold where God's kingdom is going to begin to manifest itself there in Canaan. Again, it's going to stay there essentially all the way until the cross, and then Jesus is going to resend his church into the world to make disciples of all nations. But notice Abram's call. He calls Abram to leave what was known, his household, his culture, his area, and go to a new place so God can essentially create a new community that's going to have a new ethic that it's going to live by, that's going to then spread back into the world with the good news of the gospel back when we get to the New Testament period. So what are the promises here? God has to make Abram big promises, audacious, bold, daring promises, essentially because you didn't do this in the ancient world. And many of us today, we can live wherever we want to. I grew up in Ohio, but then went to school in Kentucky, went to school in Virginia, moved to Florida, no problem. In the ancient world, you were in a very much marginalized position, even a dangerous position when you left what was known for the unknown. And so God had to offer Abram some significant promises of protection. So Abram's going to become a great nation. God's going to bless Abraham so that Abram can be a blessing. And this is going to be a key paradigm in the scriptures. Blessing comes to God's people so that God's people then can bless other people. So Abram is blessed so that he can become a blessing. And these promises are also significant because Abram and his wife Sarah are unable to have children. We know that from the end of chapter 11. So God calls even an unlikely couple to be the beginning of the good news that's going to culminate in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Because with the gospel, again, God isn't going to use typical channels of human power. God can use the second-born. God can use a childless couple. And God uses those to make sure that when